So at the end of last lecture, we were left with our S-shaped curve and saying that whether or not there would be a poverty trap was very dependent on the shape of the curve that relates income today to income tomorrow. And we gave several examples where it could go one way or the other. It could be that it says shape. It could be that it's increasing but inverted L shape. And then one of you asked the question, well, how do we know which way it is? Like, how do we even get about, how do we get to know the shape of the curve? This is not a question that is going to be solved theoretically. And the debate we just had a moment ago suggests that it won't be solved theoretically. Because, for example, take the question of whether if I give you a bednet for free today, you're less likely to buy the next one tomorrow. It depends on whether the entitlement effect is more important than the learning effect. And how will I know that? There is no way for me to know it without looking at the data. And the question is, what's a good way to look at the data? And today we're going to look at one such way, which is a way which is increasingly often used by development economists, by policymakers, and which is the main approach that we are using in the Poverty Action Lab, which is the idea of randomized evaluation. So we'll start with our malaria example. I'm going to use the malaria example because we had the debate, so we know the question we are asking. I'm going to use that as our example, but of course, the points I'm making now are in part methodological points as well. So what are we talking about? We're talking about a pretty important thing. Almost 900,000 people die of malaria every year, give and take, most of them in Africa, most of them under 5. That's the biggest cause of under 5 mortality in the world. Incidentally, you want to take every single of these statistics with a big pinch of salt because it's not that all the malaria cases are recorded. A lot of people who are not really diagnosed of malaria and are told to be died of malaria. So it could be a gross overestimate or a gross underestimate. But I think it's fair to say it's a lot of people one way or the other. As we discussed, malaria is transmitted by mosquitoes who carry the parasite from an infected person to an uninfected person, mainly at dusk. So the sleeping under a bed net, particularly under a bed net which has insecticide woven into the fiber of the bed net, is an effective way to prevent mosquito bites and therefore to prevent the transmission of malaria. And one thing that Noam said which was important is that there is 2 effects of sleeping under a bed net. If you already don't have malaria, you're less likely to catch it because the mosquitoes can't bite you. So this is a direct benefit that benefits you. So when making the decisions to buy or not buy a bed net, when making the decision to use the bed net or not to use it, you are going to take this direct benefit into account, right? But then there is another benefit, which is the externality, which is an indirect effect, which is if you already have malaria, someone else is less likely to get it because they don't first bite you and then bite them. And this benefit, unless you're an incredibly socially minded person, is a benefit you don't take into account when buying your bed net. Because you don't care, it's not you, it's someone else. But as society, we are trying to maybe adjust the individual behavior to the social benefit. There's one more thing which is important for us to keep in mind, which is this externality is not linear. So it could be that the externality is linear, which is one more person who sleep under a bed net, say half a fewer person is infected. So it would be like the more bed net you have, the less malaria you have, but in this proportional way. But it turns out that it's not proportional. The reason why it's not proportional is because once about half the population sleep under the bed net, you have something called herd immunity, which is that the mosquitoes don't have time to bite someone else before either the mosquito or the parasite dies. So if you manage to cover about half of your population, you don't even need to carry the other half. I mean, it's better, but it's not, they already benefit almost as much. So the externality benefits are like this, if you want. They're like, first they're linear, and then at some point, they have a big jump in the externality benefits, and then again, going from 80% to 85%, maybe less. So that means that this would be a little bit reminding you of the S-shaped thing, which is there will be a distinct advantage in terms of cost per malaria averted. The benefit of going from a coverage of 25% to 30% of the population are going to be lower than the benefit of going, say, from 45 to 50. Because when you go from 45 to 50, you're in the zone where every extra bednet is really helping a huge deal. So that is going to be relevant when we do the cost benefit. So that's the case for bednet. So now, if we were traditional economists, we would make traditional economic argument, which is to say there is an externality. Whenever there is an externality, we want to try to use prices or taxes to align the private incentive with the public incentive. That's why, for example, we would like to have a congestion charge in London, or we have a congestion charge in London, to make it expensive to drive your car in London, in the center of London, because when you drive your car in the center of London, that's a pain for everybody else. That's also why you have, so that could be one of the reasons why we have taxes on cigarettes, that smokers impose an externality on the rest of the people, both because of secondhand smoking and because they get sick a lot. And so you would think that society has a right to impose a tax on them so that to try and discourage them from smoking. So by using prices and taxes this way, you can try and align the private incentive to the social benefits. So this would argue, the fact that the private incentive to get your bednet is low would argue for subsidizing the bednet, but only if the private incentives are not large enough that people are already not buying your bednet. So suppose, for example, that people hated being sick, which presumably they do, then they would get the bednet anyway. You would not need to subsidize the bednet. So there would not be an effect of the price because the demand would be very high at any price. So the fact that there is an externality justifies subsidizing to the extent that the private incentives are too small for people to want to get them themselves. Another sort of traditional economics argument would be the learning argument that was made earlier, which is that trying your bednet once might give you the experience of it, and once you know how it works and you know how well it protects your children, you might be more likely to get the next one. And then there is an argument that mixes the two, which is another externality argument, which is if I try a bednet and I realize that it protects my children and it's really not so unpleasant, then maybe my neighbors will also see my bednet and say, oh, isn't this cool? We want also a bednet. So there is an externality in my trying, potentially. So those are the traditional economics arguments. These are your traditional public finance. Let's use the prices. We should subsidize. That indicates that we should subsidize the bednets. And by the way, there is no reason to stop at zero in principle. We could pay people to use bednet for that matter, if this was the way to get the optimal coverage in the community. Yeah.
So one consideration that comes to mind is if there's a segment of the population that is really, really poor and cannot afford to pay any amount for the bednets, whether they're subsidized or not, those people are also the least likely to be able to pay for healthcare should they get malaria. So they would have the greatest risk for everyone else and for themselves. Yeah. So wouldn't you want to try to provide free bednets for that set of people no matter what?
Right, so that's another consideration that you might want to include, which are redistribution consideration, which you might feel that even if the private benefit, that people who are particularly poor might have a very high private valuation of the bednet, but might be credit constrained and not be able to get the bednet. And those are the same people who will also not be able to cure themselves from malaria. So here you would want, that gives you another argument for subsidizing bednet, which is not an argument in terms of disease eradication, but an argument in terms of redistribution between people. So those are traditional arguments. They are taken, say, by Jeff Sachs or by the WHO, and say we should subsidize bednet to a large extent, or potentially up to giving them away for free.